Fantasy football season is among us. For those of you who don't already know, fantasy football is one of my guilty pleasures. And to many people's surprise, I don't actually really watch football. I don't really know who these players are. I'm probably the most clueless fantasy football player of all time when it comes to that portion of it. But I think that's what makes me such a great player. And I don't want to act like I am the god of fantasy football, but I do find it as a guilty pleasure from a game theory aspect in just looking at the numbers, breaking down the numbers, being unbiased, and I tend to perform pretty well in most of my fantasy leagues when I stick to my strategies and just go with who the numbers dictate to go with. Typically when you get in trouble, it's because you're letting bias get in your way. Today I'm going to go through these psychological factors of fantasy football and how you can avoid getting caught in traps. I'm going to go through some items to note this year for the 2020 season and things to keep in mind. And I'm just going to go through a general breakdown of this year, especially how to pick certain positions by round. So without further ado, let's get into today's video and figure out how we can make you the champion of your fantasy football league this season. There's going to be three main psychological traps that I see people fall victim to all the time. The first one that I'm going to talk about is recency bias. What recency bias is going to be how your brain starts to think about things that have happened based upon purely recent events and impacts of recent events. So in fantasy football, this is huge because everyone goes off of last year as a predictor for next year. People do the same shit with stocks. They do the same thing with a lot of other things. They think just because they've seen this happen that it's guaranteed to happen again. Or maybe you had someone on your team last year who you distinctly remember sucking because they had one bad game when you needed them to get a certain number of points that week to win, and they just let you down, and now you hate them and you're never picking them again. What I mean by avoiding recency bias is forget last season. Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. And this is where I think new fantasy football players have a huge advantage is they don't have favorites necessarily or not, and they can avoid either hyping up a player way too much because maybe they did win you a week last year, or hating a player because they lost you a week last year. It's a new year. It's a new set of statistics and predictions. Teams has changed up. I'm going to get into the next mistake that people make in just a second here. But for me, I don't like to get wrapped up and follow all the big changes that teams are making, all the line changes, where players are going, this, that, who's the quarterback is, blah, blah, blah. To me, none of that matters because the analysts are going to do all of that homework for you. That's what they get paid to do. And then they're going to rank these people accordingly on how those changes may impact the player. So you don't actually have to do all of that yourself. You can just look at the rankings that your website provides you when you're going to do your draft. With all of that being said, the reason I encourage you not to do research, it's not because I am lazy, although I definitely am not trying to put a whole ton of time into the research here. And that may sound counterintuitive to trying to win your season, but it's a thing called affirmation bias. When you are getting into your research and you're digging up players that you need to find, sleepers, all this stuff, you're gonna end up trying to subconsciously convince yourself that the players that you want are gonna be the right player. So you kind of get attached to the research that you've done, and because you've done this, you think you know better, and you're gonna start changing your opinion on players in a sense that's not necessarily congruent with their actual value. So fantasy football, in my opinion, is one of those things where the more you know, the less you actually know. So definitely try to avoid doing research to an extent that's gonna impact your decisions with thinking that you know the most. We all have this person in our leagues who will tell you, oh yeah,
this guy's gonna do this guy's gonna do that, because he has Jim Jones as his left tackle this year, and that's gonna make the biggest change for him, and he's gonna run these routes, and he did this in the offseason.
I don't care, dude. I really don't care what went on with all of that stuff because it's already baked into the rankings. Just because you're high on him, then you take him super early, because if the list says he's number 40 player, he's the number 40 player to me. You want to take him at 35 because you're hype on him? Cool, you do that. That just leaves spots for me and other people on the board to take the number 36, 37, 38, 39 players earlier than they should have gone because you just reached up for 40. Another counterintuitive tip I have for you when approaching fantasy football is don't be that guy who does a ton of research and tries to convince everyone, oh, this player is the next big thing. This guy is going to do this season. Just don't do that, because you'll get into something called affirmation bias, and you're going to end up doing all this research and then trying to convince yourself and convince other people that these players are the players to get, when in reality, the best way to tell if a player has potential is where are they ranked. That's it. I mean, the analysts already look into everything for you. You don't have to go figure out how the offensive line changed, who the new head coach is, this, that. That's all speculation, and that's already baked into their ranking. So just because you think that some player is going to perform better now that this guy's on their team now too, that's already been factored in. And if you take them higher than they're supposed to go, guess what? They're probably not going to get the value that you wanted, because their value tends to be their value. Just real quick on recency bias as well. I've done data projects involving running backs specifically and other skill positions as well, in terms of how they perform year to year and what factors you can look at from the previous year to indicate their performance for the next year. There's no statistical significance in any metric. So just because one player did well last year doesn't mean shit for this year. And lastly, from a psychological standpoint, take your emotions out of it. Take your favorite team out of it. Your favorite team on the actual football field is going to be very different than your fantasy football team. And what I mean by that is, just because, say, you like the Eagles, or you like a certain player, or you like the Jets or the Giants, or you hate a certain player, it doesn't matter. When you go to play fantasy football, you're making a fantasy team. You shouldn't be letting these things get into your head. You shouldn't be that guy who drafts 3, 4, 5, 6 Eagles to their team just because they like the Eagles. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't pick a lot of players from one team. You should just be taking the best available value. For example, I had a draft this year where I ended up with the quarterback from the Arizona Cardinals, their number 1 receiver, and their running back. I didn't necessarily want this to happen, but the value was there and I took it. I'm not a Cardinals fan now. It never was. But at the end of the day, I have to take the highest value if I want to get the highest return on my players, and that's what I recommend you do as well. All right, let's get into the juicy stuff. Where should you take each skill position by round in the draft? Well, the answer is it depends, but it all comes back to those rankings. Typically, I recommend not really reaching for a quarterback, especially in years as of late. Quarterbacks tend to all finish around the same point outside of the elites. So feel free to take a Patrick Mahomes or a Lamar Jackson earlier on, as long as you're fairly close to where they were ranked in the pick selection. But I wouldn't necessarily reach too far for these guys, especially in a 1 QB system. If you don't get one of these guys, then I highly recommend just waiting, because after that, the drop off is pretty large and everyone's basically the same. So don't give up the opportunity to take better running backs and wide receivers in order to get a quarterback if you're not getting one of the elites. And the same thing goes for tight ends. There's really 2 tight ends in Travis Kelce and George Kittle that you should be looking for. They're ranked at like the end of the second rounds, early second rounds, respectively. And if you're going to be able to get these guys near those spots, great, do it, fill that position. It's a huge advantage to have a better tight end because the drop off is so significant. But if it's not one of those 2 guys, you can buy yourself a lot of time by just waiting. I don't care if you have the number 4 tight end or the number 10 tight end. The difference is not that high, and if you just wait a little bit longer, you might be able to get more value at running back or wide receiver. For running back and wide receiver though, I always just go with the strategy of taking the best available player at the top of the board. But the only caveat to that is running backs tend to be a little more scarce, so especially in later rounds of the draft this year. There's really not as many high quality running back options as teams go into more of two-tier systems. Receivers, the top 30 receivers tend to be pretty significant, whereas it's only really the top 20 running backs that tend to have significance. So if there's a running back and receiver both at the top of the board, especially in the earlier rounds, I would tend to take a running back just to get that position filled out and be a little safer. But I'm not, if there's 8 receivers and then the 9th guy's a running back, I'm not skipping over 8 players just to get down to that running back position. So it all comes down to how much you're gonna reach and how badly you need the player in your roster. But in general, I would go with a running back over a receiver if they're both ranked pretty similarly. And I would wait on quarterback and tight end till the end, unless you see a good value in taking one of them earlier and they kind of fall to you. All right, I'm gonna go contrarian to the typical don't take your defense to the very second to last round and don't take your kicker to the last round. I'm not encouraging at all that you move up a whole lot of rounds, but what I will say is there are some perks to getting one of the higher ranked defenses, and there are some perks to getting one of the higher ranked kickers. Typically, if you have the best kicker, it can make a pretty significant difference, whether it's only 2 points a week over the course of the season. The difference that you get out of that versus taking one of the guys in the 16th round, so whoever, let's say you take a different running back in the 16th round, and now you waited and saved your kicker for the last round, well, chances are that 16th guy is not going to have any impact on your fantasy season. Whereas if you can just take the kicker in the 16th round instead of the 17th like everyone else, and then take your running back flyer or your wide receiver flyer, that rookie that might do good in the 17th, guess what? The chances of the running back or wide receiver blowing up, whether you take them in the 16 or 17, are pretty much the same. But with the kicker, that 2 extra points a week can very well be the fantasy difference maker in your season. The same thing goes for defenses. I do recommend taking one a little bit earlier than the very end. I don't ever advocate for taking one 8th, 9th, 10th round, whatever, that some people reach really far. But if you want to take one in like the 14th or 15th, just to have a better defense and just to have a more secure position, there's a couple benefits to this. One, these defenses are more likely to get more points. 2, and I think the main thing for me is streaming defenses throughout the season can be annoying. You constantly have to scout the waiver wire and you have to play matchups and you expose yourself to more risk because some of these defenses that you stream might still get beaten down. Whereas if you end up taking a defense that's a little bit better, that you can just set it and forget it, so to speak, that just opens up your roster to take more flyer positions, whether it's at running back or wide receiver, and take players that have a higher ceiling down the line and stash them, as opposed to having to stream a defense all the time. So that's where I'm at with defenses. You take them a little earlier. Same with kicker, take it just a little earlier, maybe a round or two, then as opposed to the second and last round respectively. But you'll figure it out, and I wish you best of luck with your draft this season. I hope all these tips help you guys with your fantasy drafts this season. I'm gonna leave you with a couple closing notes and some things to think about and take away. The first is going back to picking players on the same team or the same bye week. Now, when you go to pick players on the same team, a lot of people will say that that makes your team inherently riskier, you're relying too much on this offense or that. At the end of the day, when you're going to pick players, if player X is supposed to score more points than player Y, but you already have people, say, on player X's team, well, who cares? Because in any given week, even if you have the quarterback or running back or whatever as this on the same team as player X, they're still expected to outperform player Y. So if they're expected to outperform them, everything else is independent of that, and you should be taking the better player anyway. Same with bye weeks. I don't care about trying to line up my bye weeks. I will take the best value player in the position regardless of where their bye is. I don't even look at bye weeks. Some people will say that's ignorant, but a lot of my strategy is through trading throughout the season, and in order to forge a ton of trades, you need to have value on your roster to swap out. And the best chance to get people that are going to be tradable is to take the best available players and trade them later and fix your roster later when it comes time to address these bye weeks. And lastly, let's talk about late round flyers. When you get into those later rounds and it seems like you're just ready to auto draft and be done with your draft, you should be trying to pick players who have a lot of upside. Maybe it's the rookie who could break out later this year, or just someone we're not really sure how they're going to play, as opposed to the person who's been on the same team, scoring the same number of points, and is very unlikely to have a big fantasy impact this year. I don't like to play with those safe guys. I like to make sure my roster already has plenty of consistency throughout. And then when it comes time for the later rounds, take the flyers and get potential players that could have tremendous seasons. Even though it's unlikely, they're worth a lot more at the end of the season. If they blow up, then the guy who has no chance of blowing up and is going to never make it into your lineup anyway. So let me know how you guys do this season. Let me know if you disagree with me on any of these strategies or any tips that you have. Throw them in the comments, and best of luck.